While we generally accept game reviews as a sort of guide for what to expect on a new title, it's pretty much well known at this point that the reviews themselves are ultimately subjective and prone to at least some bias given the author's opinions and tastes. Occasionally, the gulf between critical reception and user perception is miles wide, leading to games loved by players and hated by critics, or vice versa. The history of the medium is littered with titles like these, experiences that, for whatever reason, resonate strongly with players and grow to become cult classics after an initial lukewarm reception from gaming journalists. And while it's possible for critics to love a game and players to hate it, more often than not, it's the players who give titles a fair shake where critics otherwise passed over them. Today we're going to be looking at 15 titles that were loved by players yet hated by critics. But in that time since their initial cool reception from gaming journalists, they've grown to become cult classics in the eyes of the players that know and love them. If we look past the chaos memes, and the initial knee-jerk reaction to Stranger of Paradise's reveal and demo, it's easy to see that Team Ninja and Square Enix's retelling of the first Final Fantasy is a Souls-like on equal footing with the developer's critically acclaimed Nioh titles. In fact, Stranger of Paradise shares many elements in common with both Nioh and Nioh 2, continuing those games' deep and rewarding gear systems and class customization, making Stranger of Paradise a veritable dream come true for anyone with even a passing interest in buildcraft and min-maxing. Beyond its satisfying gameplay, though, Stranger of Paradise adds plenty of depth and context to the otherwise threadbare story of the original Final Fantasy, and it's a game whose player base know it to be an incredible action RPG despite its lukewarm review scores. The ingredients were all there for The Evil Within to be a smash success. Directed by Shinji Mikami as the debut title from his then new studio, Tango Gameworks, The Evil Within saw Mikami return to the survival horror genre he helped popularize, only with a greater emphasis on genuine scares and psychological horror, rather than the camp and over-the-top B-movie thrills of Resident Evil. Players and critics alike went into The Evil Within expecting a darker Resident Evil 4, and while there are elements of that dream mixture present in the final product, the game was unfairly compared to one of the greatest games of all time. In truth, The Evil Within is its own thing entirely, mixing elements of Resident Evil 4's near-perfect third-person shooting with stealth and psychological horror elements to create something that stands on its own merits. While the initial hours of The Evil Within are incredibly hard and present a steep learning curve, those who stick with it know how rewarding the game eventually becomes, standing as a unique and claustrophobic survival horror title. Next, we have Kirby Airide. Kirby Airide is, for the most part, a victim of its troubled development cycle. Originally conceived as a late-stage Nintendo 64 title, HAL Laboratory would eventually shift gears for the game to launch on the GameCube, resulting in Kirby Airide's visuals and performance not quite stacking up to many of its contemporaries. But while critics were not impressed with the game's technical aspects, a devoted group of GameCube owners made Kirby Airide something of a cult classic, despite its low review scores. As racing games go, it's simpler and a little more bare bones than, let's say, Mario Kart Double Dash, but its place as the first LAN-compatible GameCube title, and as Masahiro Sakurai's final Kirby game, cement it as an important and much-loved classic on the GameCube. In general, arcade games tend to get an unfair shake from most critics thanks to their shorter length, more straightforward gameplay, and the impression that they somehow lack depth and dimension like AAA experiences. But as any fan of run-and-guns, beat-em-ups, shmups, or other arcade-centric genres can attest, arcade games are both some of the most challenging and rewarding experiences gaming has to offer, fully delivering on the premise of gameplay economy by being easy to pick up and play but taking potentially thousands of hours to fully master. The PlayStation was a dream console for arcade ports along with the Sega Saturn, and one of the PlayStation's best arcade ports is Capcom's Strider 2. Mixing 3D environments with 2D character sprites, Strider 2's visuals and aesthetic are as timeless as its razor-sharp, side-scrolling hack-and-slash gameplay, and its challenge is just the right level, to where players will need to learn the layouts of stages and enemy placements before they're clearing the game on a single credit. Suda51 is probably one of the more notorious developers to ever work in the industry, and Killer 7 was his first title to receive a Western localization, introducing a whole new audience of players to his incredibly offbeat and singular creative vision. While Killer 7 is ultimately a pretty straightforward on-rail shooter in a first-person perspective, it's the title's visuals, story, and soundtrack that set it apart as one of the more unique titles on the GameCube. While critics were mixed on the title at the time of its release, Killer 7, along with just about every other game from Suda51 and Grasshopper Manufacture, has since earned a massive cult following from players who resonate with its bold and original vision, daring to be as weird as it wants to be and bucking just about every AAA action game trend of the era. Sometimes, all it takes for the perception of a game to turn around is a greater understanding of its mechanics, and such is the case with Baroque, an action roguelike RPG released at a time when few players had ever heard of that genre combination. Baroque is a boldly original game like nothing else on the PS2, or any other console of the era for that matter. It was originally released in Japan for the Sega Saturn and PlayStation, before eventually receiving a localization nearly a decade later to the PS2 and Wii, and it remains a singular experience on either console. Today, action roguelikes with RPG elements are a dime a dozen, and count themselves as prestigious Game of the Year winners or nominees. Baroque is an earlier attempt at the genre that, were it released today, would likely feature critical scores that more closely align with its place as a beloved cult classic among players. The PlayStation was home to a host of at-the-time misunderstood games that pushed the envelope of standard genre convention, and Koudelka is a prime example of this phenomenon. Part RPG and part survival horror, Koudelka is technically part of the beloved Shadow Hearts series and is the cult classic franchise's progenitor. At the time of its release, critics largely panned Koudelka for its story, despite praising its RPG gameplay and dark, horror-tinged atmosphere. Players, however, were much more receptive to its mix of genres, going on to make Koudelka a surprisingly successful title in spite of low review scores, paving the way for future games in the Shadow Hearts series. Today, Koudelka is recognized as a pivotal fifth-generation title with an almost universal positive player perception, cementing its place as a certified PS1 cult classic. Regardless of each new release's quality or innovation on the franchise's formula, every new Pokemon game seems to go over well with fans. But the same can't be said for the series' spin-offs. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon: Explorers of Sky is one such title that, despite a welcome reception from series diehards, didn't really resonate with critics. It's an enhanced version of the DS Mystery Dungeon titles Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness, and it earned plenty of goodwill among longtime Pokemon fans thanks to its inclusion of several Gen 4 creatures missing from those original releases. Still, Explorers of Sky was developed by none other than Chunsoft, who put its experience on the Dragon Quest series to good use in a solid dungeon crawler set in the Pokemon universe. Like Killer 7, PNO3 is part of the group of Capcom games, dubbed the Capcom 5, that the studio developed specifically for the GameCube. PNO3 is also a shooter, although it swaps Killer 7's first-person perspective and Tarantino film atmosphere for a third-person sci-fi action combat game. While critics would pan PNO3 for its apparent shallow gameplay and short length, players generally considered the title to be a throwback to the golden age of arcade shoot-'em-ups, and the title quickly became a cult classic despite low review scores and poor sales. Notably, PNO3 is another title from Shinji Mikami, who would later go on to repurpose many of the best ideas from the game in Vanquish, which is largely considered to be one of the best arcade action titles of the 7th generation. The now legendary God Hand is the third title on this list from famed developer Shinji Mikami, and is the director's modern-day take on the classic beat-em-up. While the title would ultimately end up being Clover Studios' final game and both a critical and commercial failure, God Hand's over-the-top action and quirky comic relief proved to resonate strongly with players, resulting in the title ending up as one of the many cult classics on the PS2. Today, perception toward God Hand has shifted to the title being recognized as a sort of misunderstood masterpiece, with many of the outlets that originally slammed the game pulling a 180 to claim it as one of the best titles on the PS2. The first original IP from famed RPG developer Obsidian Entertainment, Alpha Protocol is essentially Mass Effect meets Mission Impossible. It borrows the over-the-shoulder third-person shooting action from BioWare's sci-fi space opera, but switches up the setting to a modern-day spy thriller. And while Alpha Protocol is, admittedly, not without its jank, it does feature the trademark strong writing and compelling quest design that Obsidian is known for. For proof of how loved Alpha Protocol is among those who have played it, look no further than the successful efforts to preserve the game through a DRM-free version on Good Old Games and a relisting on Steam. While love for David Lynch's Twin Peaks is practically universal now, especially in the wake of 2017's The Return and the auteur's recent passing, 2010 was a very different time. Quirky, offbeat, esoteric sci-fi and horror certainly had their adherents. For proof, just look at Remedy's Alan Wake. But the pop culture zeitgeist had yet to shift to a point to where properties like Twin Peaks had become part of the mainstream. It was in this period that Hidetake Suihiro, colloquially known as Swery, began developing and then released his love letter to Twin Peaks with the open-world survival horror game Deadly Premonition. Results were predictably mixed. Deadly Premonition actually holds the Guinness World Record for being the most polarizing video game between critic and fan reception, making it a perfect candidate for a list like this. And, like many of the fellow titles here that join it, it has since gone on to become a cult classic. While a lot of games loved by players and hated by critics are titles that gain a cult following and appreciation in the wake of their release, some games see a hard dividing line drawn between their critical and fan reception at launch. Such is the case with Days Gone, which, like a lot of the other games on this list, is an example of the gulf that exists between gaming journalists and the average player. While most major review outlets slammed it for being too formulaic and familiar, player sentiment couldn't have been further skewed in the opposite, praising the title for its story, gameplay mechanics, unique approach to open-world traversal, and the impressive horde battles with hundreds of zombies. Players may love Days Gone, but the sad truth is that the game's cool critical reception is likely why we'll never see the sequel that Bend Studio unsuccessfully pitched to Sony. Square Enix's Nier is an interesting title in that its polarizing reception is mostly due to the fact that its localization didn't do it any favors. Notably, Nier is a spin-off from Square Enix's Drakengard, and it would release as two separate titles. The first of these is Nier Replicant, which would originally be Japan exclusive before receiving a modern remake. The other is Nier Gestalt, which is an alternate story featuring different characters. What Western players in North America know as Nier is actually Nier Gestalt, and critics would essentially misunderstand its story and gameplay despite it resonating strongly with fans of the Drakengard series and action RPGs in general. Thankfully, despite poor critical and commercial performance, Square Enix saw fit to localize Nier's sequel, Nier Automata, which is commonly understood as one of the greatest games ever made. Although Capcom's Monster Hunter is now one of the studio's most successful franchises, it might surprise you to know that the series was critically panned in its initial outing. In fact, poor critical and commercial performance of the original Monster Hunter in the West is the prime reason why North American players missed out on several series entries until the franchise made its way to the Nintendo DS and 3DS. But while critics in the West would fail to see the appeal of Monster Hunter's core gameplay loop, the title would prove to be a massive hit with Japanese players, going on to spawn dozens of sequels and spin-offs, all while retaining a cult following of Western players who would ultimately help the series experience a renaissance with Monster Hunter World. That's going to be it for today. Let us know in the comments any games that we missed and head on over to cheatcc.com for the full article. And, as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.